Take it away, Dragon. We're live.
Okay, good. So I think it's the right moment to start today's Hangout. So welcome everybody to today's session. In this week, we have the theme of social network analysis, and probably already had a chance to have a look at the content of the DALMOOC for this week, some of the video presentations, some of the resources and assignments. So the whole topic is dedicated to social network analysis, how we study social networks, but with a specific focus on how we are using this specific technique for education and in educational situations. Today with us we have a guest, Shane Dawson, who comes from the University of South Australia. He is Associate Professor, Director of Learning and Teaching Unit at the University of South Australia. More importantly, for our sake in today's conversation, is that Shane did a quite interesting research in the field in which he used social network analysis for different educational contexts. Probably the best known work Shane did, and I would say one of the best known works done in the entire field of learning analytics, is on the tool called SNAP for extracting social networks. So I think that Shane would be the great person to talk to about these topics, and the best person probably to start this week with this. So Shane, good to have you today, and very pleased for taking your time to connect with us. So could you help all of us understand what's social network analysis, and how would you define social network analysis?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here, and after that intro, I hope to meet expectations. So social network analysis, it's a great field. So it's a great methodology for looking into the relationships around individuals and how individuals interact with one another, whatever we're defining as an individual or an actor. So social network is generally defined around a set of social actors, or what we might call nodes. And these members, these actors are connected by a particular form of relationship, and you can define that relationship however you particularly like. So it then allows you to visualize. So to give a really easy example is just even your family network. So people interact together, talk to one another. You may have email friends that you want to extend out into that network, and then you can have a relationship then between different folks according to that. So essentially, social network analysis goes back a very long way, but most particularly in the 60s and 70s was out of Harvard with the likes of Barry Wellman and Mark Granovetter. Their work there was really around trying to establish methodologies for visualizing, if you like, working out how community groups, how social groups interact with one another.
Great, thanks, Shane. So you mentioned here that social networks can be used to represent different types of actors. So what typically those types of actors could be? In most of cases, we would think those would be just people talking to each other. Is that just so?
No, not at all. So, if you think about social network analysis, it's even based on websites. So think about links in a web and how they connect together. And there's some, there's actually a great show that looks at how networks, the structure of networks and having the major nodes there, even airports, even thinking about traffic flows and networks on roads and so on. So there's work that looks at how people migrate from home to work and what buildings they might dip in and dip out of, and using the buildings as a particular node, then a structure, and the people are the actual relationship then that mediate between the two buildings. So literally, in terms of network analysis, it's anything that forms a network and what you define a node, which is what makes it such a great resource, a great methodology. If you're looking at the great work you and George and Carolyn and Brian Baker are setting up at the moment in terms of the MOOC, merging the XMOOC and the CMOOC together. The CMOOC, you actually have the technology itself then can be a particular node. So that mediates different forms of relationships to others, whether that's a blog or a wiki or anything else, that's Twitter, it could be anything.
Right, and that That's really fascinating to know that we can have a technique that connects people, technology, but also content and information that these people are using and sharing, right? And so in that sense, like when we are looking at networks, what we are actually looking like, what kind of links we can establish between individuals? What those links could be between actors? Could those be just simply the information shared, or what are the commonly used principles?
Sure, sure. So that's, I mean, Martin Delat does good work in this area when he's, what's he called his tool? I can't remember. It's not Netlytic. That's Anatoly Screws. It escapes me for the moment. It might come back. So he has a particular tool that actually does content analysis and the network analysis. So in that case, you can define it around looking at the particular types of language used, for instance, and what types of topics of discussion, and that might be through an email, it might be through chat, or it might be through storytelling or some other form and process of communication. The other ways it could be, rather than just information sharing, might be resource sharing. So there's multiple other avenues into that space as well.
And so that basically explains, although we are talking here about social network analysis, these types of networks that we are analyzing really can be fully socio-technical, right? So any social and any types of technical nodes can be included into those networks, as well as these types of links that can be established there. Could be many different types of interactions that these nodes may be interacting with. That brings us to the other type of question, and that is related to the types of data collection, or how do you typically in your research, but also how other traditional researchers constructed social networks before they applied even social network analysis?
Sure, sure. Before I jump in there, I'll just mention about ties, because that relationship between two actors and whatever you're defining is, it's important to establish around what Mark Grenevere calls the strong and weak ties. And so we don't tend to have a lot of really strong ties because they take up, from a time analysis, if you like, a cost-benefit analysis, they take up a lot of time and effort to get a reciprocal process back if you're looking at it from a capital view, where I invest a lot into, say, Dragan Gasovic and giving him all my resources and information, and we establish a really strong, close relationship there. But you also then have lots of weak ties, and it's weak ties that tend to do a lot of the work in this space. So when you mentioned before around what types of ties can you have, I mean, the work that we've done is mostly around student-to-student interactions, which tend to be in class, so they're formal settings. So they're very much based on a notion of weak ties. So the slice that we take in terms of looking at it is never captures the whole network. I don't think we ever capture you can't capture the full network, no matter what we do, of who people interact with. But it gives us a view around the impact of our pedagogical approaches on the development and establishment of those weak ties. And so that's where we want to get to. So, so what techniques and methods of S&A do we currently use? I think that was your question. I don't really know there, Dragan. So essentially what we do is we developed Snap. So Anisha Bakaria, who's a beautiful person and a fantastic programmer, worked with us on establishing a process of how do we extract information out of a learning management system way back in the days when you couldn't actually get into the back end of it. So this is where Snap came from. We wanted a better way of trying to visualize networks because we realized that social interactions was the driving process in much of the learning. That was the theory that we wanted to apply there. So we tended to scrape the page and build these interactions. So at the moment, lots of people around S&A techniques are using log and then looking at any form of interaction around those log data. So Dragan, I know your team has been looking at Twitter compositions and networks across Twitter, so when people might reply to a Twitter feed. So again, scraping log files and looking at any form of relationship there. The analyses, I guess it's more around the tools. So I mean, there's lots of different methodologies. It's graph theory, so it's just math. There's a lot of formula associated with it that tends to form around the calculation of what is the density of the network. Which means then if you've got a density of 1, it means everyone in that network essentially communicated with every other person in that network. We'll look at centrality in terms of closeness, betweenness, which is a really interesting one, and I'd recommend, I think you've got some of Ronald Burt's work up there. on your as one of your recommended readings. And then you've got numbers of degrees, and then within degrees you've got in degree, people who contact you, and you've got out degrees, who that person contacts. So those centrality measures tend to be the main ones, and then there's others around sort of importance measures and so on as well in terms of the vectors. But it all comes back to what is it really the question that you're asking, and then trying to analyze that your network from the view of that question. So you might be interested. One study we did, I think, is around looking at creativity. We were very much interested in the students who had a high betweenness scores, which is based on Ronald Burt's work. Betweenness being someone who bridges, more in Ronald Burt's terms, a structural whole. So if you took that person away out of the network, you'd end up with two separate clusters. So the person in the middle has these fantastic abilities to communicate early, communicate more broadly, and they get information earlier than other people in the network in terms of the flow and so on. So it really drives on the question. In that case, we're looking at creativity. So we wanted to really look at it in terms of what are the between the scores there. Is that an indicator? Can we get indicators of creative capacity in that essence?
Right, and so that's a fascinating thing, Shane, and your research showed, and research of several others that you build on, and also who build on your research as well, found some kind of common patterns in terms of some of these social network measures that you mentioned, like centrality measures that individuals may have, especially those who are network bridgers or those who occupy these structural holes, that they are more associated with a higher level of creative capacity, higher academic, but also professional performance and so on. So could you actually provide a bit kind of interpretation? Why is that so?
Sure. So essentially, in terms of the betweenness, it's where we're looking at the notion of creative capacity. And creativity is an amazing field to think about. And where it's come from. But in essence, you can break it down into the notion of, rather than creativity being that light bulb that goes off into someone's head, it's a set of attributes that someone may have, and a lot of it is seeing things in a different way. That's the simple way of doing it. So if you're getting information from a group that you don't normally coordinate with or interact with, then that information and that vocabulary that community comes up with is very different to the one that we have. So if we were to go and talk to, if we walked out at the moment and walked into a hospital, the way that the surgeon communicates to the doctors and the nurses is very different to the communication that we have today, or the communication you have at home. So you have a different vocabulary and different sets of rules and regulations that go on. So when different community types solve problems, they do it, that's based on their needs and their situations. But when you actually take a solution that they've come up with and apply it to a different field, it is often a creative way of looking at things. So the people that actually do that well are those that sit in the camp, so they actually talk to many different groups. So it means you need, in Martin Delart's terms, they'd be looking at their network capacity and their network learning. What is their ability to be networked and agile and move across different groups and have a communication process that actually allows them to do that? And they are indicators of creativity. People who do that well tend to be seen as more creative. And that was where Ronald Burt was tapping into as well, is that people who in organizations who don't necessarily have to be the managers, but people who bridge different groups in the organization, have these conversations, are seen as the ones who actually take ideas and get them going and moving forward. Now, whether that's causal or it's just an attribute of, that's exactly what we're looking at. So the process there, could we now identify this through the network structure? So if we went through communication logs that students had, can we actually extract that out, map out the network, and then predict and say, do students play that same role in the same context of Ronald Burt's work where he's looked at it in organizations?
Right. No, that's very interesting, Shane, what you are saying and how you are connecting with the work of Ronald Burt's and others who did also in organizational behavior. So now from the very practical perspective for an instructor, okay, so if I know that certain students are occupying certain structural holes in my classes, what can I learn from that? Or if I know that certain students are not occupying those structural holes, what would be my interpretation from that? How could I potentially improve some of my classes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? So yes. It all comes. The answer is 42, apparently. So it all comes back to, again, what's your pedagogical context. So I can give an example where we had a fully online course, and actually the students who occupied that betweenness, that bridging role that I just spoke about in terms of creativity, we looked at it in terms of student satisfaction. So in one context here, the lecturer, the academic, was trying to create an online sense of community with students literally all over Australia. And they were part-time students. Something like 80% of them worked in the field that they were now studying, which was early childhood education. And what we found was the students who bounced around a lot, and so they tended to occupy that betweenness area, were literally the most dissatisfied with the course. So the process there where the academic was trying to say, okay, I'll let the students talk amongst themselves to build up that sense of community, which is a very, very common practice we would advise instructors on. You want to build sense of community, give the students opportunity to talk amongst themselves. So they were leaving the students to answer those questions in this particular case, and the students were very dissatisfied because they didn't feel at home. They didn't want to talk. The actual tight cluster that the students were forming, they didn't feel like they fit in there, and then they didn't feel like the academic was actually giving them the answers they needed. So they bounced around towards all these different clusters trying to find somewhere that they belonged to. And in this case, those students tended to have their network extended out beyond the class, beyond this online class, and into that professional practice. So they had their close friends, and they also had their academic friends that they were talking to on a daily basis, which were their colleagues, their work colleagues. So they kind of fit into two worlds. When we flipped it and we had a look at it again in terms of creativity at the Graduate School of Medicine, again, it was a different structure where we've got a community coming together where the students saw each other face-to-face, but also they participated online. And we had different online discussion forums there to play with. So when we went through and analysed it from that perspective, in this case, there wasn't the same fragmented notion around we're trying to build community through an online environment, because they literally had that community because they saw each other on a day-to-day basis in the face-to-face component. Looking at it in terms of creativity, the betweenness then was a measure of creativity. So it literally comes back to what are the questions you really want to ask here to be able to address, and then what are the techniques and approaches that you need to do to be able to understand that. So in terms of giving the instructor the question, I think I gave you a very political answer of saying I really don't know.
Yeah. No, thanks, Shane. And I think that's really important. Last point that you made there, and that is related to importance of the question. So unless we have a clear question that we want to ask, and to inform that question with data and the data that is coming from social network analysis, we really don't, we cannot really just depend on the numbers that these measures will produce for us, right? So and that's, I think, quite critical to understand about any types of analytics. I'm here talking about learning analytics, but we can also see general trends on any kinds of analytics that are used in other different areas. So in this very specific case, we really see importance of something which we know very well from education, and that's scaffolding. Even if we are talking about online educational context, even if we are talking about social interaction, we still boil down to the same old question that even that social interaction needs to be scaffolded, right? And so potentially that even very case study that you just mentioned, and which is related to the dissatisfied student, although who is potentially biggest network broker, who probably doesn't feel so well connected with anybody else, probably can capitalize on these connections the most. And then that's really interesting question for us. So what would be potentially some advice or recommendation then for instructors how to build their potentially scaffolds? Or better to say, you also had some interesting paper in which you suggested how analytics can inform teaching process and learning design. So in that sense, how some of these techniques could potentially be leveraged so that the role of instructors can be evaluated, instructors can see the insight into their pedagogical approach, and at the same time push it and remove their participation in active discussions at some point in time. So if you can just touch on that.
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, feedback's the most important thing. So, and I think it really depends on your pedagogical context. So, I mean, Laurie Lockyer has done some great work in learning design, along with Peter Goodyear, around patterns of design and so on. if you, a really simple one, if I set up a discussion forum around a Q&A process, so if students have a question, knock yourselves out, put it up there, and we'll go forward and answer it. And the way that you would scaffold that process is, you'd want to even look at rate of return. Basically, do we have the question answered, and is it the appropriate response? Done. So it's a very quick, easy form of analytics, being able to provide quick feedback there that you can then go forward. If lots of students have that same question, you could even have a ranking process on it. Then you might go back and say, okay, we have a conceptual misunderstanding here. I'll spend more time and revisit that course concept. Alternatively, as I mentioned before, if you're looking to create a sense of community, then you're looking at the network diagram and the structures there. Completely different. So you don't want to see isolated students sitting off on the side. Again, they tend to be disgruntled ones as well, as much as the student in between us. The ones who sit off, no one's answered them. So, they haven't had a reply to anyone. They've made the effort of making a post, but no student and no staff member, no tutor, no one has replied to them. So, again, it's a quick way in which you can look at, am I getting the structure that I really envisaged? And a lot of the time, you will see the instructor being the core part of the network, the middle hub of what we might call a wheel pedagogy, where you have this, or a stellar, a constellation, where you've one central node and everyone comes off and hangs off that node. It's driven by the instructor. So the instructor provides the information and students receive that information. It's even a directed process in much of the networks we've looked at. So again, if that's not what you want, you're trying to build a community of interactions, then there really is, you've got opportunity early on, not late. A lot of our reflections or evaluations of courses are 13 weeks or at the end of semester. And then we go, well, that didn't work, and then our cohort all changes and we try something else. That's the beauty of what we're doing here, is that it can be very proactive and say, okay, I can see now that Dragon hasn't been responded to. Humans is in the center of the network and he's occupying that whole space and he's hogging all the conversation here. He's being a dominating student, so I might want to just have a word to George and say, how about you let others communicate and play nicely here. So, I mean, there is opportunity to bridge and look at how you could scaffold in that. And I know some of the work that you've done there with your team in looking at community of inquiry, and then looking specifically around how you actually build up cognitive presence, cognitive processes in that area, is a really great way of looking at a particular framework and then adding a very concrete underlying analytical process to be able to evaluate and give early feedback, not only to the instructor but to the students. So.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shane, and thanks for referring to that work. And I mean, probably we discussed even before, and becomes always a question: what is the source of that kind of social capital that students have, or the reasons why students have certain network positions? So, for example, one of our recent also studies shows that, for example, depends on the types of messages that students are exchanging online, they may increase or decrease their social capital. For example, we discussed about between-us centrality, and if students tend to have higher level of between-us centrality, they typically are responding to the questions of others. However, those students who are just receiving responses and they are typically just complementing back the response that they receive, that is negatively associated with their social capital, which means in a way that you can't just be in the network to ask the questions and expect that you will benefit from the network. Rather, from that network, you also need to be actively engaging into the process so that you are building your social capital. Would you comment on that?
No, you're absolutely right. I think it comes back into your questions and the way that you're looking at the network. So I think it goes back around, and I'll comment and say it's great work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, but you're decreasing now your social capital. Sorry. So let us, Shane, turn on to more kind of practical thing for the students in the DLA-MOOC. And we obviously have a very diverse population in this course, students with many different types of skills. And some students are afraid that they may not have enough technical skills to deal with social network analysis or any types of analysis in this case. Yourself, as a person, although you have a science degree, you are really an educational researcher with your PhD in education. How much knowledge of math and stats and anything is needed so that we can conduct some of these basic social network analysis, say in GAFI?
I failed Year 6 maths, so it's not a lot. So I've struggled ever since. Now, I think you don't, like anything now, I think I like social networks. They're just intuitive to me. I really like looking at them. They make sense. I'd say dive in. That's really play with these things. They're not overly complex. You don't need to know the high level of math. You need to know what the definitions are. So there's many tools out there. If you look at Gephi, it'll spit you out more math than you can deal with in a year. So around analysing a particular network. So it's really the interpretation that is absolutely critical. It's not the math that's critical. There's tools and that can help you with it. I don't need to program, for instance, to understand how, I know how Word works. I can use Word. It's a tool for me now. That's the way that these things like Gephi are. They'll give you the information. It's the interpretation of really the responses and the visualizations that are being great resources out there around interpretation of networks and what it means and so on. So I would say get in and play. I mean, the nice thing, even if you just want to put your network on a t-shirt, they look fantastic. They'll be a hot seller. Go for it. So you don't need a lot of maths and you don't need a lot of programming ability. I've got none. I would say the great thing, once you start to play with networks, you realize how important it is to network. And then and how equally important it is to understand the drivers and priorities of other groups that you're playing with. So you can't have a conversation with a mathematician or a statistician without knowing the basics of that and understanding where they come from and their views. Likewise, a statistician, and there's great data analysts out there, and there's fantastic, you look at the number of jobs that are popping up in learning analytics. At the moment, a lot of them are very stats driven and data mining driven. It's the interpretation of the data that will always be critical. So does it make any sense that we ever find predictors of, that students' distance from university is a predictor of academic performance? Well, there's not much an academic instructor can do about it other than provide some bridging elements. But telling a student that you're at risk because you live a long way from the university doesn't really help them. It doesn't help them study. You can actually build in processes around it, but it doesn't help them study. So there's areas of data that have high impact and areas of data that have low impact. And so we have to have a look at the practical significance, and that's where a lot of the interpretation will come into these spaces as well. And that, I think you need the mesh of it. I mean, at Lassie, it's very successful Lassie at Harvard this year. There was a lot of conversation around what makes a great learning analytics researcher or analyst. I don't think it's one. You can't have one. That's the beauty of this field. It's so interdisciplinary. I don't think there is a learning analytics expert in the world today. There's people who have different specializations that fit into the field of learning analytics, but there isn't one. When you get a team together, that's when you'll have great impact. And I think it's that networking and understanding around the conversations that's critical. So for your DALMOOC participants, great opportunity to play around with tools like Tableau, great visualization tool in terms of looking at analytics data. Gephi is a fantastic tool, again, just for playing around and having a look. But there's lots of other network tools, social network analysis tools like NetDraw as well that are available that you can just have a play with, throw in some data, see how it works and see what happens, and then start to have a look at what falls out.
No, thanks much. And I think, Shane, in that sense, you quite summarized some of the important messages that we wanted to draw, at least in weeks 3 and 4 when we are talking about social network analysis. It is one part of the story that we can understand what social networks are. We don't necessarily need to understand the entire math behind computation of each of these measures, but we need to understand what is the operational definition of, say, between a centrality or closeness centrality. Second important thing is we need to understand what data sources we can collect from, but we don't necessarily need to know how programming needs to work to scrape, for example, data from Twitter. And the team and the collaboration we have also, Shane, you have a student who has background in education without any technical skills. She's working with the other students who have technical skills, and they complement each other. And that's the real nature of multidisciplinary teams. On the other hand, she fully understands how to interpret the social network analysis, and I think that that's the beauty of this field, and I think also summarizes in a way some of the most critical best practices how to use social network analysis. Given that we are approaching the very last minute of this course, of this session, just one last message that you can send to the participants of this course?
One last message: have fun. It's a great opportunity. There's some, I mean, as you go on, there'll be further richer areas of analysis you'll undertake with Carolyn Rose and Ryan Baker, and you've got a great opportunity here to play with social network analysis. Network as much as you can and have a look at the data sets that you can extract, and there's very, very simple ones that you can start to play with. Tawny Roxo went around and even just asked people, who do you trust in your network? Who would you ask people around? So if you're in a workplace, it's a great thing to do. Just go around. Who do you go and seek questions about, programming? Who do you call up to help? And it's a quick way in which you can map out your own network and start to play with tools like Effie and just see where the interactions are. And there's very simple things you can do. If you're working in support centres as well, learning and teaching support centres in particular, a common problem there is that you always see the same people. The same ones always turn up to every workshop. You don't really branch out into what we might say in the university of the staff that we would hope would come. But do those people that are always coming, are they actually feeding on into your network? Are they active nodes? And so you could do very, very simple studies by just going in and asking them, who do you interact with in your school or your faculty or your research group? Who do the people do you go to? So,
great.
Underline, have fun.
Thanks so much, Shane, for taking time to connect with us today and share some of your experience and thinking on social network analysis. It's been a pleasure. I also thank everybody in the course for taking time to have a look in this live session and look forward to interacting with you in the next 2 weeks on the topics related to social network analysis and, of course, by the end of the course related to any topic related to learning analytics. Thanks for your attention and talk to you soon.
Cheers. Thank you.